good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
Thanks to all for another wonderful meal. That was great. Mama used to say it was yummy, yummy in her tongue.
Yeah, bring a little food.
Okay, so we are continuing in your notes. It should be lesson 9. I have the full lesson 9 up here if you need any portion of it here on the front. And we are okay. No, that's no problem. Here you go. And so we're picking up in right before Jesus would institute the Lord's Supper and some things there. There was a very significant occurrence involved one individual in particular, and so we were discussing the significance of that individual and that event as we wrapped up. And so tonight, that is where we'll pick up, and that individual is Judas. And so we were discussing about the nature of the situation with him and what occurred there on that night. And so Jesus made a prediction numerous times, but in verse 21 of chapter 13, when Jesus had said this, he became troubled in spirit and testified and said, "Truly, truly, I say to you that one of you will betray me." So the following verse says, the disciples began looking at one another at a loss to know of which one he was speaking. And so we discussed a number of times in the words of Jesus leading up to this day, and a couple times already on this day, that he is indicating that he is going to be betrayed by one of them, and now very clearly he says it, and now they're looking around the room trying to figure out who. And so we discussed a lot about that moment, and then what would occur shortly after. So when they heard the prediction that one of them was actually to betray Jesus into the hands of his murderous enemies, they looked incredulously at one another. Now it is to the credit of these disciples that each one wondered about the possibility of his own apostasy, naming some other person as a likely traitor. Now this also indicates, we said about the nature of Judas in this moment, in his role in the group, that they automatically didn't all go, that didn't seem to be what was going on there. It wasn't a bunch of finger pointing. It was more introspective and wondering in that moment. But it indicates the full acceptance of Judas by the other disciples and their lack of the least suspicion of him. But somewhere along the line, Judas had gone wrong. And we have talked about this many times. We have evidence that he was a thief. And so he was ripe for the picking here. And so now, I wasn't aware of this too much, but I think some of others of you had made reference to this. Some modern fiction writers attempt to heroize, I don't know how you pronounce that, Judas. They try to make him out to be a hero. Anybody ever heard of that? That without him, in the role he played, that all this would not have happened. And so, kind of like almost like the way he was viewed in doing something for the good of the faith. And so, there are some modern fiction writers, and I'd like to know exactly, I wish there was a reference here to who, But no amount of conjecture, it says, but this is a perversion of the scriptural account. Clearly, no amount of conjecture concerning the motives of Judas in betraying Jesus can change the clear-cut declaration that before the betrayal, Judas was already a thief. John 12:6. Now this phrase is interesting. God chose Judas to betray Jesus, but God did not ask. That's an interesting way of putting it. Chose. What do you think about that?
Well, in order for the scriptures to be fulfilled, it had to happen that way, didn't it?
Okay, so this is the question we ask ourselves. Does foreknowledge equal causation? So we got to be careful here in how we think about this.
Brian?
Yes.
Do you think it's fair to say God chose a person to betray Judas?
You mean that there would be a betrayer? I'm comfortable with that.
And that's how I think it, that's how you can say he chose Judas. He chose somebody and it just happened to be Judas. He didn't make Judas do it. You didn't choose him in that way. He just
So I would say when he chose somebody, I would maybe narrow that language to this was part of the plan, but it was up to the free will of the individual as to who would fulfill that role within that plan. Because, and with his, he does have foreknowledge and omniscience. So he knowing what would occur under certain circumstances does not negate the free will of Judas in this moment. God merely knew what choices Judas had made and would make. Now, I think that's a good explanation. I'm careful with the words God chose Judas. Understand it. Rob.
Isn't this God that is outside of time? He really just revealed what had already happened to the person that wrote about it. It's really a description of something that had already happened to God in his eyes, because he's outside of time.
Sure.
It's really just a revelation of something that's already happened to God.
Okay.
And in his knowledge of it, it's a description, basically.
Okay. That is an interesting way to think about it. You're making me think here. We're getting into some of the theories of time, and when, like I've brought this up to you before, is when you really discuss the nature of time itself, and you start getting into God's foreknowledge in relationship to time. I mean, you were in the deep into the pool. And so that is an interesting perspective. I'd have to give that a little thought. I think it's more, I think the only thing that's coming to my mind when you make that statement, Rob, is that that's more like Biff from Back to the Future, who has the book on who's going to win the sports stuff, and he knows who to bet because he has the knowledge of what's already happened. It might be, I think it's a little more than that dynamic, I guess what I'm trying to think about and trying to figure that out in my own mind, but that is an interesting perspective. Now, not by any compulsion or coercion from heaven, agree with this statement wholeheartedly, but by his own free will, Judas committed himself to walk the way of dishonesty and selfishness and rebellion against God. So, not by any compulsion or coercion. Right? God, by his own free will, he rejected the teaching and example in the person of God's Son. Jesus said he would give the betrayer a piece of bread dipped in the dish. Yet even when a sign was given to identify the traitor, the disciples were not sure who he was. Now, two factors help to explain this. One, if Judas was seated beside Jesus, a piece of bread could be handed to him quite unobtrusively, and perhaps only John heard Jesus tell the meaning of that gesture. This may be an indication that Judas had indeed presumed to take the seat next to Jesus. Another factor is the complete confidence that the disciples had in Judas. He must have been a man who displayed a pleasing and confident personality rather than a sullen, villainous appearance that artists often use to depict the traitor. Apparently, the disciples trusted Judas as fully as they did anyone else in the group. Now, when Judas took the bread, three things happened in rapid succession. So let's read. Verse 26. Jesus therefore answered, "That is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him." So when he had dipped the morsel, he took it and gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. So now there's a lot of detail here as to not just any Judas, but this Judas. After the morsel, Satan had entered into him. Jesus therefore said to him, "What you do quickly." Now, no one of those reclining at the table knew for what purpose he had said this to him. For some were supposing, because Judas had the money box, that Jesus was saying to him, "Buy these things we have need of for the feast," or else that he should give something to the poor. And so, after receiving the morsel, he went out immediately, and it was night. So when Judas took the bread, three things happened in rapid succession. The first one was what? The devil had already prompted Judas to follow the course he was taking. If you go back to 13:2, which we had talked about, and Judas had turned his back on God and chosen the wrong way. He had been planning the betrayal of Jesus before and had already received the 30 pieces of silver, sealing his deal with the enemies. He was only waiting for the opportunity to hand Jesus over. But apparently Judas was still struggling with himself and indecision. Now at this point, he had no return and allowed Satan full control. So even up until that moment, and the things that Jesus was saying up to this point, maybe there was a chance for him. We don't know. So Jesus told him bluntly to do quickly what he was. Judas didn't realize Jesus knew who his betrayer was. This was a moment to repent, but Judas gave himself more fully to the devil instead. He left the room immediately. Tragically, John adds, and it was night. Night indeed for a life that had chosen darkness. So now, yes?
In verse 2, when it says, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas, how was it so easy for him to put that into his, was Judas just bad from the beginning?
Well, what comes to, when he says put into his heart, what do we have? What's the dynamic we have at play here? What's another biblical term we use here?
Hardened.
Hardened, okay. So remember, we talked about this on Sunday, that Satan is working hard in temptation on Judas in this moment. He's been tempting him to do this. And so we have indication, as we've mentioned, that because of the character of Judas, that he was ripe for the picking. So there are all certain things that we all struggle with, and if Satan puts it before you, then like, looky here. You know, and with him it was that 30 pieces of silver. He knew that he was greedy and a thief, and so that he was possibly the one to whom he could attack. And so your question was, why was it so easy? Well, do we know that it was easy from this verse? Maybe there was a real internal struggle with Judas. We don't know. But we do have evidence that he had a flawed character that led to this, is the way that I understand it. Anybody else have any thoughts?
What is that part where it talks about it's not sin until you give in to your own lust?
Okay, so it's James chapter 1, and it talks about the progression of sin. And so that when we are tempted by our own lust, and then when that conceives, it gives birth to sin. We combine that with what we said in 1 John chapter 2 about the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the boastful pride of life. And when we determine to give into that, that's when sin, comes to be. Lynn?
I was just, you just wondering if there was any comments on her
Right.
thinking it was easy for him. I was just going to say, I think his reaction afterwards, which I mentioned that before, about him, the regret that he had. I think that alone tells us that it wasn't easy for him.
Okay, that there...
He felt like he did after it was all over.
Sure.
And if he thought it was an easy thing to do.
Okay, so there was some, surely there was some moral struggle there. And there was some regret afterwards. Beth and Barb?
I think the easy part came because it was greedy. He was obviously a very greedy person.
Right.
Pilfering in the treasury, so that's probably where the easy part came. He was going to get 30 pieces of silver on it.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's some serious character flaws in there that made him vulnerable in this area. Barb?
What Kathy asked about verse 2. Judas had made up his mind before he had ever come to the supper that he was waiting for the opportunity to betray him, because it says that during supper the devil had already put in the heart of Judas. So he was just waiting for the right time
Yes,
to,
The question is, what do we mean put there? That's where we got to be careful with the idea of put, like he didn't have a choice in it, but
yeah.
he's tempting him big time, and it's already given birth, and he's just waiting for the opportunity. He's already taken the money.
Yeah.
So.
And might have been planning this, we don't know how long.
Oh, certainly.
In his mind.
Absolutely.
Or is it that Jesus actually gave him the time to do it?
The what?
I mean, in other words, all throughout the time of Jesus, the 3 years there, he always told them it wasn't the right time. He escaped many times,
Sure.
captured and everything. But this time, he allowed it to happen. He's the one that said, go quickly.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Again, we talk about the fact that Jesus is well aware of what's happening. He wasn't tricked. And so, interesting stuff here. So, the devil had already prompted Judas to follow the course he was taking, and Jesus told him bluntly to do quickly what he was going to do, and Judas left the room immediately. Now we have a life in the balance. Now, freed by the departure of Judas, and I think this is significant, Jesus went on with the words he was anxious to share with his disciples. In chapter 13, verse 31, when therefore he had gone out, so now Jesus is ready to move forward with some more important things that's going to occur this evening, now that Judas is gone. Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified him in himself, and will glorify him immediately. It's a lot of pronouns, and glorify him. So, little children, I am with you a little while longer. You shall seek me, and as I said to the Jews, I now say to you also, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So, freed by the departure of Judas, Jesus went on with the words he was anxious to share with his disciples. In verse 31, it was the idea of glorification, that God was glorified, that he was going to be glorified. This is it. This is the moment in time. This is the beginning of the end of the beginning. This is the pivotal moment in time when everything is coming to that critical point in time when everything was going to be different. So now we have this word departure. In verse 33 it says, I'm leaving, you can't come where I'm going. Bad news. Or is it? And then a new commandment. His glorification meant his death on the cross, but also his resurrection from the dead and his ascension on high. Furthermore, he would be glorified through coming centuries and a growing host of men and women redeemed from sin and death and destined to life everlasting. All this glory would be shared by the Savior and the Father who sent him. Departure for them was a real time of sadness. But even if the disciples could not follow at the time, they would follow later. Verse 36. Where are you going? Jesus answered, where I go, you cannot follow me, but you shall follow later. Now, that's kind of a loaded statement, isn't it? What's he saying? Okay, so what's he mean?
Second coming?
Second coming?
I mean, we know what it is.
So where's he going right now? Where's he headed?
To die.
To die. I'm going to die. You're not coming right now. Why? Because I have a job for you to do. I've been training you for a long time for this, and you guys are going to turn the world upside down. Or right side up. But then, you will follow me. Now, was this prophetic in a way?
Yeah.
So, what, following in death, but maybe manner of death as well?
They were all going to die for the same cause, for the cause.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Peter was when he on the cross upside down.
Yeah, that's what
History.
church history tells us, is that he was crucified upside down. The new commandment. So actually, departure was a time of sadness, but even if the disciples could not follow at the time, they would follow later. The new commandment was love for one another. It would hold them together and mark them as disciples. Even so, we are bound together and marked today. And so this verse here rings of another verse that comes up later here in John. But listen to the dynamic. Is if you love one another, then all men will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. And so there's another verse that comes up just a few chapters later that has that same ring to it, that involves the followers of Jesus. And it has to do with whether we're together or not. Whether we're united or not. when Jesus prayed in what we call the high priestly prayer that's recorded for us in John, he says that he prayed that they may be one, speaking to God, that they, his followers, the apostles in this moment, would be one as you, the Father, and I are one. So the oneness that is found in Jesus and the Father, he's praying that for his followers. And then there's a so that. You guys remember the so that? Anybody remember? So that the world may know that you have sent me. So, love, in much the same way, does amongst God's people, does love divide or bring people together? I think true love that's based in truth brings God's people together, and it lets people know that they are truly followers of Jesus. And if you're truly followers of Jesus, you'll be one as God and the Father are one, and that will let people know that Jesus is in fact sent by God. There's a lot of the same dynamics in here. That there's results of our oneness, of our love, that the world's going to notice certain things about us. And ultimately about God. It's going to bring glory to him. Now, Peter could not stand the prospect of separation from Jesus. He was ready to follow right then. He burst out in verse 37. He says, Lord, why can I not follow you right now? I will lay down my life for you. Now, if we stop right there, it's like, yes. That guy's he's a frontline leader, fighter, right? But then the next verse. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Really? You sure you want to hold to that right now? Truly, truly, I say to you, a cock shall not crow until you deny me 3 times. I will lay down my life for you. How little he knew of the events to come that night, but Jesus knew, and he gave Peter warning. Before the rooster would crow in the morning, Peter would deny his Lord 3 times. Despite his claims of loyalty, Peter must not only bear the prospect of separation, but also the dreadful prospect of denial, of doing the very opposite of what he desired. What a burden to be added to all the other burdens that were. Peter had a little this. Peter had a lot laid on him in this 24 hours. Right? He was dealing with a lot, made the claim that he would die for Jesus, and then denied him. Judas, likewise, had made some of his own decisions. Think about how they responded to their sin. Think about what choices they made after the original bad choice. We really have 2 sides of a coin here that are, it's the same thing but very different in how they chose. See, what happens a lot of times when we sin is it's kind of like the proverbial snowball. And it kind of snowballs and gathers steam, and then you're just kind of caught up in a series of unfortunate events. I can think of a particular person of biblical history that would just one bad decision, then led to another bad decision, that led to another bad decision. My mind goes to David. Think of how it started. And it wasn't, whoa. It was, whoa.
That's a little exaggeration here. That's pretty good.
He had a decision in that moment. He chose, and then he had some more decisions to make along the line. And I mean, think of all the things that ended up in him being an adulterer, a liar, a deceiver, a murderer, a conspirator, cover-up, and all that kind of stuff. And so what happens is, when we sin, our following that moment of sin, but that's important. How we respond to our failures. Because anybody here never failed God that way? Anybody? Keith?
It just makes me think of, sometimes, just for me personally, times that I felt like I've been my weakest when I look back at it.
Uh-huh.
The things that happen afterwards,
Mm.
And you have confidence in, your walk and everything, and you get humbled.
Yeah. Peter got humbled pretty quick, pretty hard, right? How he responded to it, though, is very important. When we think about what happened with Judas, he was remorseful, clearly, but how he handled it. So what a burden to be added to all the others. But what tipped the scales in Peter's favor was his faith in Christ, the love he had learned from the Master, the repentance he was willing to make in his commitment. The difference between Judas and Peter was that Judas, with burdens too heavy to bear, betrayed the only one who could really help him. But Peter turned to this one when he found that he was unable to bear his burdens by himself, and clearly Jesus is the only way. Now, in spite of everything, we see Jesus saying some pretty remarkable things here. Of everything that's happening. In chapter 14, verse 1, it says, "Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I'm going." Thomas spoke up and he's like, "Lord, we don't know where you're going. How do we know the way?" Jesus said to him, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me." Now, there's this interesting thing here. As one drives along the shore in a place called Haifa, Israel, a person passes a strange sight. It's a ship resting in a dry dock, and it's in a roadside park. It stands as a monument to remind passers-by of the courage and daring of a shipload of desperate Jewish refugees who ran the British blockade, and in spite of everything, made the shore. The name given to the ship is a Hebrew word meaning "in spite of." Now, this is what can be written over the 14th chapter of John, in spite of everything. Surely in these difficult final hours, Jesus could be expected to have a sad and mournful message about his departure from his disciples, his coming agony, his shameful treatment, and his death. But that's not what we see here. In spite of the unknown to man, Jesus could give guidance in the only way. In spite of going away, he could send another comforter. In spite of conflict, he could provide peace. In spite of separation, Jesus could promise return. Jesus is the victory in suffering. Now, Jesus was giving his words of farewell to his beloved disciples in the closing moments of this gathering in the upper room. A deep chasm separates the final farewell of a Christian from that of an unbeliever. We'll read that one more time. A deep chasm separates the final farewell of a Christian from that of an unbeliever. If you've ever had the opportunity to attend a funeral where everybody there knew that the person that was laying there in the casket was an ornery scoundrel and had nothing to do with God, and that the people there have no understanding or no care for God, it is a dark, dark place in that room. There's no hope. There's no hope for anybody. And there's even times when people try to say things to make it better, but they know. Am I the only one that's ever experienced? Anybody else experiencing anything like that? It's different. Compare that to a room full of believers. It's totally different. Totally different. The people that I've seen that mourned, and it was despair. I mean, it was just utmost despair. It's because they had no true hope. Now, a person, I've seen deep mourning in people that are Christians, that they know the fate of those that have lost those loved ones, when they know that they're good, that they were faithful Christians with lots of fruit. That the feeling and the hope that's in that moment is completely different. Now listen to this. There was a fellow by the name of Catullus, Catullus. He was a Roman poet of the 1st century before Christ. He put the pagan's feeling into words when he gave his closing remarks over the fresh grave of his own brother. Here's what he wrote. But lo, these gifts, the heirlooms of past years, are made sad things to grace thy coffin shell. So all the stuff we put on here on your coffin, that's all it is just stuff. Take them all drenched with a brother's tears, and brother, for all time, hail and farewell. This is it. He knew, for him, in that moment, in a Roman worldview, that pagan worldview, he knew he was never going to see him again. It's done. For him, nothing was left. Socrates, as many weird ideas that he had, however, believed there was more. But he did not know what. So he believed there was more, but didn't have any clear understanding, really. Socrates said, now the time for my departure has come. Our paths go separate ways. You are to live and I am to die. Which is better, God only knows. But Jesus taught us how to say farewell without the emptiness of Catullus or the uncertainty of Socrates. From Jesus' words to his disciples, we learn about the path to take. And so, in those first 6 verses, you can find deep assurance. Jesus told his disciples to stop the turmoil in their hearts. Let not your hearts be troubled. They could have peace and assurance if they would just trust in God and trust also in his Son Jesus. Believe in God, believe also in me, he said. After all, death is not the end. Jesus, by his death and resurrection, was going to prepare a place in heaven for all the people of God. Jesus said the disciples already knew the way to the place where he was going. Thomas objected to that. He did not even know where Jesus was going. He said, how could we possibly know the way? We don't know where you're going, so how could we know the way? Then Jesus gave further assurance. Think about this. Similar to Abraham, or Abram. Did Abram know his destination? Nope. In fact, that's what I've been teaching for the last couple of weeks, and we'll be teaching again tomorrow to students at LBC in the book of Genesis. He didn't know where they were going. He just knew that he was to go. But as he was going, he didn't as much put his faith in the destination as he was in the one who was going to get him from point A to point B, and that was God. God for Abram in that moment was the way. Yahweh. So if Jesus himself was the way, if one knows Jesus, if you know Jesus, then you know the way. And if you know the way, then you'll end up where you're going to end up, even if you don't know where you're going to end up. You know what I'm saying? First of all, Jesus tells us not to be shaken, not to be afraid, not to let our hearts be troubled. Now, the word for troubled comes from a Greek word denoting a heavy sea in the midst of the wind and the storm. Now, I've heard you tell some stories, Danny, about how you've been on the lakes when it gets rough. Scary feeling.
Very.
Yeah, is your heart troubled in those moments? I mean, the sea. I mean, it can be. You guys ever watch those shows where they're doing the deep sea, like for crab or whatever they're getting, their lobsters? You know, you ever watch those ships on those waves? I'm like, that scares me to death, and I'm sitting on the couch. You know. Anybody else here ever been out on the water when it's gotten crazy? Beth, you have? Keith? Gary, you have? What was your feeling? Nancy has?
Yeah.
How'd you feel in that moment?
Roller coaster ride.
Yeah. It was fun? You be quiet. All right. We're talking about dread and trouble here. I didn't know we were dealing with Evel Knievel here. All right. What did you feel in that moment? Anybody else? I mean, were you scared?
I'm sorry?
Were you scared?
He went, he slept through it. And I
Oh.
didn't know.
Okay, Jesus on the hull of the boat.
Yeah, but it was like, here was the thing.
Are we talking about a cruise ship?
Yeah, we was on a cruise
Oh,
ship.
okay.
But it was like.
Still.
It was bad because we had this thing over at the end of the bed, curtain, and that rod would go. It put me right to sleep. She said, it was bad. I think it said 40 foot.
She's laying there in the bed with her life preserver on.
I knew where it was at.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's a serious thing when you're in the heavy sea in the midst of a wind and storm. That's the Greek word here. Now, the injunction to put our faith in God may have several connotations. Now, the Greek word means believe, but it also means put your trust in. We've talked about this 100,000 times. Commit yourself. In this context of Jesus' closing words to his disciples when he was about to be betrayed, the word trust has a particular significance. All three meanings have their place, but if a choice has to be made, at this point, there was a crucial need for trust along with belief and commitment. There is no doubt that these disciples believed in God. Although at times they might question his action or his reasoning, they had no doubt about his existence. But now, in the face of tragic events and loss of a loved one, of shattered hopes and constant peril, Jesus urged them to trust in God and to trust also in him. Now, think about this, right? And this is something that crossed my mind. When you think about this whole account, you think about Jesus in the room and that Jesus is about to die. You think about the apostles and what they were going through. Try to put myself in their place. But it's hard to do because I know what happened. I know that he did rise from the grave. In the moment that happens, when the kiss comes and the guards come, they were worried maybe about him dying and never seeing him again, and this was it. It's hard for me to envision that feeling and being able to really understand what that's like because we know that he came back from the dead. You know, we're just like, this is just step one of a process. Right? He's going to die on a cross. He's going to be in the grave. He's going to come out of the grave. We've heard it a million times. But without that knowledge, can you imagine what they were thinking? My friend is going to be killed. I don't know. And then he says, trust in me. But then they watch what happened. As they beat him, as they mocked him, would you be questioning things? Would you be like, what, how am I supposed to trust in him? Look what's happening to him. This is the worst I've ever seen. How am I supposed to trust him? That's happening and they're seeing it.
We also see that doubt after crucifixion when he went and hid.
Certainly. Yeah, I mean, I really believe a good portion of them are like, we're done, this is it. But see, it's hard for us to really appreciate that moment because we know what happened. Go ahead.
You mentioned before that, Jesus didn't necessarily have the knowledge that God did at the time that he was here on earth as a man.
Okay.
Do you think that he knew that he would rise in 3 days? I guess he did because he told them.
I'm pretty confident of that, yes. Yeah, he knew he would rise because and God's going to raise up in 3 days. I think he knew that. Knowing that, it didn't diminish what he was about to go through. But I do think he knew that. He had that knowledge, yes.
But so why do you think that he wasn't more clear with his disciples and tell them, like, this is what's going on? I'm going to be beaten, I'm going to be crucified, but I will be back in 3. Like, I wonder why he didn't.
He did tell them. Yeah. But he told them in numerous ways and numerous times, but they just, like everything else, they just didn't get it.
You'd think with Lazarus being risen, just.
That would have, yeah. Again, remember, we're talking about roller coasters, talking about the emotional roller coaster of everything that's happening and their expectations and everything that was wrapped up in what they were caught up in. Keith?
Well, just the high from him raising Lazarus from the dead to, then all of a sudden they see him being beaten and tortured and everything that he had to go through and wondering, why can't he, if he can raise the dead, why can't he stop what's happening?
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure all that stuff crossed their mind. I guarantee it was just a whirlwind of stuff. So Jesus is saying, look, trust in God, trust in me for what's about to happen. That's the only way you're going to get through this. So now, in the face of tragic events and loss of a loved one, of shattered hopes and constant peril, Jesus urged them to trust in God and to trust in Him, God's one and only Son. Jesus assured them they need not worry about Him. You don't need to worry about me. I guarantee you they were deeply worried. As you could imagine if you saw one of your closest companions, a loved one, get drug off and all the things that were happening. He would be actively engaged in preparing a place for His disciples, His followers. And in this place there would be there would be room enough for any who would come. And if we are to be together in the future, then this earthly parting is not the end, and our catalyst is wrong. All right, well, I think we're going to go ahead and stop here. We're going to pick up at verse 7 and what's going to happen here. And when we talk about the role of the Spirit coming up, Jesus says, it's good that I go. Makes no sense for them, I can imagine. A lot of interesting things that Jesus said to them in this crucial moment. All right, any other thoughts, questions?